It is very quiet. I can still hear their voices in this place. My wife, Edith, declaring in her precise manner, "Coffee. I want a cup of real coffee." Mr. Van Pels, "I want a hot bath all the way up to my chin." And my dear gentle Margot agreeing with him. "Yes, yes, me too." Mrs. Van Pels, "Cake! I must have cake." And humble Peter merely wanting to go downtown. These beans fell out of a sack of supplies when Peter was dragging them up from the storehouse below. And my Anna, of course. So excited by the thought of freedom she could barely contain herself. I would be so overjoyed I wouldn't know where to begin. There are other sounds that echo in this place that I long to forget. Those that came for us on August 4th, 1944, the day the German soldiers took us all away. The Van Pels, Dr. Fritz Pfeffer, my wife, my daughters, and me. It was early morning. I was helping Peter with some schoolwork. I heard the stairs creak behind the bookcase. And then the door opened and a man stood there pointing a gun at us. Enough of these unpleasant memories. I have always believed in choosing life over mourning. Oh, forgive me. My name is Otto Frank, and I welcome you to this, my old office building. I have left this annex, where we are now, in its original condition as much as possible. Look around you. This is where my family lived in hiding from the Nazis, along with the Van Pels and Dr. Fritz Pfeffer for 2 long years. And this is where my Anna grew from a child to a young woman. And this is where she wrote much of her diary. How many of you have read a published version of Anna's diary? She would be overjoyed to know her words had reached you. Of course, when she originally received it, she had no thought it would be published for all the world to see. When she received it on her 13th birthday, she only intended it to be a friend, someone to confide in. She even named it Kitty. When we were going into hiding, it was one of the few possessions that she put into her bag. I stuck the craziest things in my bag, but I am not sorry. Memories mean more to me than dresses. That was my Anna. Once we were in hiding, the diary became more and more important to her. She wrote in it almost daily. And sometimes she would share with us funny stories and episodes. She was a very animated girl. She even repeatedly asked Johannes Kleiman, one of the men who helped to hide us, if he wouldn't mind bringing one of her made-up stories into a magazine. That's how badly she wanted to be published. And then one day she heard a radio broadcast about how letters and diaries would be published after the war. She was so excited. My Anna wrote, "Just imagine how interesting it would be if I were to publish a novel about the secret annex. Why, the name alone would make people think it was a detective story." Seriously though, 10 years after the war, people would find it very amusing to read how we lived, what we ate, and what we talked about as Jews in hiding. She immediately set to work, putting together passages she felt would be worthy of publication, and careful not to alter too much, even things which might embarrass her. She worked at it with such patience, making plans for her future as a writer. Those plans were all put to an end the day we were arrested. Her diary ended up scattered all over the floor. She didn't even glance at it. Perhaps she had a premonition. At first we were imprisoned here in Amsterdam, and then we were taken to the Dutch transit camp at Westerbork, and then on to Auschwitz. There the men were separated from the women. I turned for my final glance at my wife and daughters among the crowd of terrified people being taken away. I shall remember the look on Margot's face for all of my life. Peter and I and the other prisoners were marched for 2 miles in the darkness to the main camp. There we were stripped, shaved all over and sent into cold showers. Then we were given striped prison uniforms, wooden clogs, and they tattooed us. My number is B9174. 6 months later, Auschwitz was liberated by Soviet troops. We were free. I made my way back home to Amsterdam to my family. It took me 2 months. My path led me back here to meet Gies and her husband, who had helped us by bringing us supplies the entire time we were in hiding. And I searched for my family. I was desperate to have them returned to me. I put advertisements in the paper, and I asked every survivor returning from the concentration camps, "Have you seen my girls?" I hoped, and waited, and waited, and waited. Finally, I learned that Margot and Anna had been taken from Auschwitz to Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, and that their mother had been killed. At first, I had high hopes for the girls. You see, Bergen-Belsen was not a death camp, and a survivor had told me they had been seen, like little frozen birds, but alive. When my Anna could no longer handle the fleas and the lice, she threw away all of her clothes and wrapped herself up in a blanket. They both had typhus, a terrible disease that was common in the filthy camps. One day, Margot fell from her bunk, and the shock from the fall killed her. Without her sister, knowing her mother was dead, and with no idea I was alive, my Anna died just weeks before the camps were liberated. My one comfort was that Miep had rescued Anna's diary after the soldiers left that day. She kept it in her desk drawer, never opening it, just keeping it to give to Anna when she came home. I didn't have the heart to read it at first, but when I did, I was amazed. A completely different Anna to the child I had lost was revealed to me in these pages. And once I began, I could not put it down. In it, my Anna had written, "My greatest wish is to be a journalist someday. and later on a famous writer. I want to go on living even after my death. It was then that I knew I had to publish Anna's diary as a testament to her in the spirit of her ideas and ideals, because she could no longer do that. In most relationships, it is the child of a famous parent who has the honor of continuing their work. In my case, the role is reversed. Every year I've received hundreds of letters from young people who want to be like Anna. They compare their good, free lives with the situation Anna was forced to live in. And they decide they have a duty to achieve something with their life. What most moved me about reading Anna's diary was the insight it gave me to her innermost being. Despite the good relationship I had with her, she had never made known to me her innermost thoughts and feelings. I learned much of Anna from her diary, but I also learned much from her. I also like to think she learned from me. A few weeks before we were arrested, my Anna had written, "It's a wonder I haven't abandoned all my ideals. They seem so absurd and impractical. Yet I cling to them because I still believe, in spite of everything, that people are truly good at heart. I must hold on to my ideals. Perhaps the day will come when I'll be able to realize them." We cannot change what happened. All we can do is learn from the past and realize what the discrimination and persecution of innocent people means. I welcome you to this annex, and I ask you to keep my Anna alive in your thoughts and actions. Work for unity and peace. And when given a choice, always choose acceptance over prejudice, kindness over persecution, and love over hatred. I thank you again for visiting with me.
Thank you very much for joining me. My name is John, and I am an actor here at the Children's Museum, and I'd like to give you the opportunity, if you have any questions about anything that you just saw, or anything about the gallery in general, that I might be able to answer for you. And that is okay if there aren't any questions. It's a lot to take in, so.
How old was Anna when she died?
She was about 16 years old when she died. And Peter was around 18, and Marga was around 19. And so these were all kids. Yeah. And I think that's what makes the story compelling, I think, is that it's a child. I think it's easier for us to connect with a child. How many of you had said you had read the diary before? All right. It was first published in 1947 in Dutch, so unless you read Dutch, it might have been a little dry. It was translated in 1951 or 52 into English, and since then has been translated into over 60 languages. There are actually two versions of the diary. When the diary was first produced in 1947, which was 2 years after the war, it took a while before people were ready to talk about it. After the war was over, people said, "We're done, let's move on." But there were several million people less in the world, and we needed a human face to that horrific event to be able to process that. And so when the diary was first published, Otto pulled some of the things out of the diary. It's a 13-year-old girl's diary, so there's some things in there that maybe Dad doesn't want everyone in the world to be reading. There were some coming-of-age portions of the diary that were removed for Anne's privacy as well as for Otto's privacy. There was a troubled relationship between Anne and her mother Edith, which makes sense. She's a 13-year-old girl. She's going to fight with her mom. And also the troubled relationship between mom and dad, which if you live for 2 years locked up with anyone, you'll probably want to scratch their eyes out. So those things were removed from the original version. And Otto said, after I pass away, which was in 1980, they said, you can publish the full version. So at that point, we got the full fleshed out version of Anne, which I like better because she's a snarky, funny, sassy, smart pants little girl, and that makes it real. She's not just a martyr, she's a real person. And I think that makes it hit home a lot more. That's a real person that we're talking about that went through this whole thing and was able to find hope and peace through all of it, which is kind of amazing. So, yes?
What happened to the helpers that were arrested?
That's a good question. Meep, who was one of the office workers in Otto's business, was a huge support for them, as well as his business partner who took over the running of the business once the war started. The Nazis took over and said Jews can no longer own businesses, and so he turned it over to his partner to run it during the war. After the war, he took it back. But all of the helpers were taken and talked to for a while. Meep somehow dodged it all. And part of her version of the story is that when the officer came to talk to her, she recognized his accent and said, "You are from a village near mine." And he said, "Yes." And so there was a connection. And so for some reason, she dodged any sort of major punishment. The others were held for a while and then all escaped major punishment because there wasn't any, they couldn't put enough together to put enough of a case on it. One of them did end up going into hiding himself at some point later in the future as well, but luckily Meep was able to survive. She just passed away a couple years ago. She was 100 years old. She actually visited here at the Children's Museum in the 1970s and did some presentations down in the Lilly Theater. Really amazing woman, and if you don't get a chance to read her book, she's a true hero. Yeah. I have a question for you all then. Otto said that he didn't have the heart to read her diary at first. Why do you think that was? It may seem obvious to some of us, but maybe not to others. Does anybody keep a diary or a journal? And if you do, who is the very last person in the world you want to be reading it, right? Your grown-ups. And grown-ups, you don't want to be reading that, right? Unless you're one of those parents. There's probably a lot going on, right? Out of everyone that went into hiding, all of Otto's family that he was with, his wife and his 2 daughters, and his friends and their son, and Dr. Fritz Pfeffer, who was with them, all perished in the camps. Otto was the only one to survive. And he lived a long, full life, a long, long time to hold the burden of guilt, of survivorship. So he made it when everyone else in his family didn't. So to reread that diary must have been really difficult, I would imagine, to relive all the pain that your child went through that you can't stop. And to relive that over and over again must be really unbearable, I would imagine. He did remarry to a fellow survivor, and there was a daughter as well. And he lived a long, full life. He died. He was about 90 years old when he passed away of lung cancer. But he did go back home, but it was a little difficult to be there, so he wrapped up things in Amsterdam and moved, I believe, to Switzerland and settled and eventually passed away there. So, do you have any other questions for me or any comments or anything? All right, well, I will open the doors, and if you do think of anything you'd like to ask me, please, I will stay here in the room. Feel free to ask me anything you like. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you.